Is the individual the center of the universe? In order to answer that question, I'm going to reference and do some reflection on Kant's second preface for the Critique of Pure Reason. So in order to answer this question, first I want to get into the medieval conception of the universe, Copernicus, and what it is that Kant is actually responding to. So in the Middle Ages, there was something called the Great Chain of Being. This was a metaphysical conception of the universe where it was hierarchical, where God was on top, then beneath God were angels, and then man, and then animals, and then plants. And man was literally at the center. The earth was the center of the solar system, or conceived of. It was a geocentric model. The earth was at the center. And then man was at the center in the hierarchy, because man, or humankind, is both material and spiritual. And so this created a very structured, ordered understanding of the universe where humankind had a certain place, a definite place, and a definite sense of location and support in terms of thinking of who they are and their place, not only in the world, but in all of reality. So when Copernicus comes along, it represents both a new scientific breakthrough, but also a metaphysical breakthrough. It represents a dramatic restructuring of our conception of the universe. And so what Copernicus did, of course, is he moved us from a geocentric model of the universe, a model where, as represented in the Great Chain of Being, where the Earth is at the center, to a heliocentric, that is, where the sun is at the center of our galaxy. So as I said, this is not just a scientific change, this is a change in metaphysics. It's a change in what we conceive of as the nature of reality. Okay, so I'm going to argue in this video that Kant responds to this crisis of displacement, this massive decentering of humankind, by reasserting our role at the center, but in a much more modest and contained way. Man is now the new center, the individual is the new center, but in terms of the limitations of human reality and human perception. So let me get into this and explain the shift and explain exactly what Kant is doing. Okay, so Kant gives us a summary of the Copernican shift that places the focus on the spectator. So it's really important for him to make this move from science to metaphysics, and to make his point, it's really important for him to focus on the role of the spectator and what exactly the spectator is doing in terms of their placement and their relationship to advancements in human knowledge. So let's get into this. Let's look at this on page 8. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so he's describing Copernicus. So Copernicus, having found it difficult to make progress there when he make progress in the sciences, when he assumed that the entire host of stars revolved around the spectator, he tried to find out by experiment whether he might not be more successful if he had the spectator revolve around the stars and have the stars remain at rest, right? So what Kant is describing here is that Copernicus, he was trying to discover the rotation of the stars mathematically, and he found his calculations were never adding up, things weren't going correctly. And so he was able to make a breakthrough and find a new insight when he instead realized that, okay, maybe the individual is not at the center and the stars are moving around, but rather the earth is moving, and that's creating our sense of motion. So when Copernicus made that shift, he ended up being able to figure out more, find out more about the rotation of the stars. And so this is very important because Kant is describing the shift from the geocentric to the heliocentric, not only in terms of the scientific breakthrough, like the third person objective perspective, like the individual was at the center, now the individual is not at the center. Kant is really focusing on the spectator, and again, the point of view from the spectator. And so although the earth is no longer at the center, Kant still keeps a central focus on Copernicus's understanding of the role of the spectator in observing motion, right? So he really brings the focus down again onto the first person, onto the individual. And so Kant continues with this type of approach when he describes the history of the scientific revolutions, and so, or he describes the history of other scientific revolutions. So he said, something dawned on all investigators of nature when Galileo let balls of a weight chosen by himself roll down his inclined plane, or when Torricelli made the air carry a weight that he had judged beforehand to be equal to the weight of a water column known to him. Right? So what he's focusing on here is usually we think of the history of scientific insight as new understandings like opening up to us through new knowledge or through the availability of new knowledge. And what Kant is really focusing on here is this shift where it's not so much just new knowledge magically became available. He's saying that human beings developed new procedures like the scientific method. They developed new approaches to measuring and standardization that then, when applied to nature, revealed new understanding, revealed new insights. And so he's really focusing on the history of scientific revolutions in terms of innovations, not in just some magical discovery, but in innovations in our process of investigation. So he continues, he says, what all these investigators of nature comprehend was that reason has insight only into what it itself produces according to its own plan, and that reason must not allow nature by itself to keep it in the leading strings, as it were, but reason must, using principles that underlie its judgments, proceed according to constant laws and compel nature to answer reason's own questions. So then he goes on to describe that we should approach nature not like a pupil like a student who just writes down everything the teacher says, but rather like a judge who has a system of laws and structures and asks nature to answer to him, right? So he really sees this important shift, and he's really, really focusing on the role of the spectator and having set standards and establishing methodologies that then lead to new insight. And so with that understanding of how revolutions happen in the scientific revolution and the scientific understanding, he then shifts to talking about metaphysical philosophy. And so, as I kind of was describing before, metaphysical philosophy is the area of philosophy that deals with what is the nature of reality. And so that could be, is there a God? Is the universe infinite, or has the universe always existed, or was it created? Other questions like, do we have a soul? Is the soul immortal? So all these more abstract questions about the nature of reality have continued since the beginning of philosophy, and Kant really sees a problem with this mode of philosophy because it hasn't answered any questions. He talks about how it takes a few steps forward, and then it takes a few steps back, and it never really progresses in a meaningful way. And so he describes the state of metaphysics as that of it's one to, waste its time practicing its powers in mock combat. It's constantly in a kind of sparring match, and it's never really prepared to make real progress in any kind of real way. It's just almost a kind of game. And then he said, at its worst, that metaphysics has become a groping about among mere concepts. So it's just gotten into this kind of armchair speculation to questions that we really can't answer. So Kant is really concerned about this, and he wants to advance metaphysics by drawing on these scientific insights in order to make metaphysics not just speculation, but make it a science, a methodological mode of understanding on its own that can provide serious insight. So let's see what he says. Okay, so how is he going to do this? He's going to make this switch. So he makes this switch by asking what happens if we assume that objects, our perception, objects that we perceive, are actually conforming to our mind and not our minds to objects. And so he's making this big transition where he's saying, let's not look at the nature of the world. Let's look at the nature of the human mind, and let's look at what it's grounded on, like what its limits of understanding are, and what he calls its a priori foundations. What are the foundational features and categories or structures of the human mind, and that make it possible to even know the world, and that are actually shaping our perception and understanding. So this is his shift, and it, again, you can see it starts to put then the spectator at the center, and he sees it as offering a possibility for new insight. Okay, he says, however, that this shift toward looking at not the world, but reflexively looking at the human mind and what it's actually capable of knowing, he says that this has a disturbing result. He says that, so he says that as a result, our power to cognize a priori, as in the foundations, mental foundations, produces a disturbing result that seems highly detrimental to the whole purpose of metaphysics. That the power to cognize, with this power to cognize a priori, we shall never be able to go beyond the boundary of possible experience, even though doing so is precisely the most essential concern for metaphysics. And so what he's saying is, and he spells this out on at the very end of this preface, he says that in order to reach questions or answers about, the existence of God, freedom, immortality, that we would actually have to go beyond human experience. And so under his conception of metaphysics, we simply cannot answer those questions because they're outside of human experience. And so for Kant, all we really can know, we can't know God, we can't know freedom, we can't know immortality. All we really can know is the human mind, and we can inquire using our rational capacities to inquire into the nature of the human mind and human experience. And so then to get back to my question, is the individual the center of the universe? And for Kant, the answer is yes. As the rational spectator, the individual is the center. The individual is the thing that's asking questions. The individual is the one who has this capacity for reason, and as a result of having this rationality, desires a sense of meaning, desires insight about the nature of the world and nature of understanding. And so all inquiry for Kant is human inquiry. It's based in human understanding. So in that way, we are the center of our world. We are the center of our reality because it's a human reality. And so the downside to this, then, of course, is that because of the Copernican shift, it's clear that we can't know what reality is, what he calls in itself. And by in itself, he just means what reality is outside of human perception. We have no access to the in itself. We only have access to what we know through our human conceptual apparatus. And so this is a very interesting insight, but I would ask or respond to that would be, is rational autonomy, so man no longer has the support of God, of a structured great chain of being universe with a geocentric universe. Man no longer has that support anymore, that guiding structure that gives him a sense of self or gives the individual a sense of self. And now Kant is instead suggesting that rational autonomy, our capacity for rationality, our capacity to know ourselves and to be governed by laws, is enough to sustain the individual. And so I would ask, is rationalism, is like rational thought really enough to sustain an individual in a society without these structures, these supporting religious structures and worldview? And the response to that question, a lot of later critics will respond, especially Rousseau and the Romantic poets. They'll say, no, that rationality is not enough, that rationality actually causes chaos and confusion. It isolates us. It causes forms of inequality. It disconnects us from each other and our emotions and the world. And so The Romantic poets and Rousseau were very critical of this hyper focus on rationality, and instead suggest that we need to be more grounded in our sense of self and feeling and our connection to ourselves and our connections to nature. So I'll leave you with that.